Good morning, everyone. It's so exciting to see so many people interested in Houston history. Quite often, people are not as interested in history as those of us that do a lot of research. And when I'm doing my research on African Americans and their lives, some people are like, why are you studying that? And I think it's really important to study a portion of the population of any area that tends to be marginalized in our history. So that's why I tend to be a very avid scholar in researching African Americans and slavery in particular. So when we moved to Houston many years ago, I was so excited to get a chance to meet some historians in the area, and I was very thankful to Dr. Malosi and Dr. Eric Walther and Dr. Joe Pratt at the Department of History here at University of Houston to share with me what riches are found in the history of Houston. So I was very thankful for their guidance. And so I'm happy to share with you a lot of the information that I've been able to accumulate over the years. And, you know, I kind of forget how long I've been researching this. And when I think back, I usually would say, oh, I've been working on it for about 10 years. But when I think about it, it's like, it's actually been 15 years off and on that I've been researching the slaves of Houston. And so I'll share with you a little bit about what I've learned from delving into all the historical record. First of all, I've spent a lot of time in a lot of archives. I've looked at secondary sources, primary sources, mainly looking at wills, court records, slave manifests. So I have to give a shout out to all the archivists that support scholars. So it's really important to get a chance to delve into the records. And as I've extracted information from those primary sources, what I've been doing is I've been developing databases. And so I have a database for slaves and free blacks in Houston. I also have been going through the slave manifests. There are thousands of people in there, and I'm building another database. So I can see trends, and I can track people. And so it helps me to see what's happening in the lives of these people. And I know our topic is specifically looking at the 1860s, but I even take it back even earlier, because when you think about the people of the 1860s, well, how did the slaves even get here in the first place? And so that's why most recently I've been going into the records of the slave manifests that are housed at the National Archives. And so let me kind of explain to you a little bit in a brief summary about the slave manifests, and then we'll get into some other topics regarding the individuals and slaves in general here in Houston during the 1860s. When I've studied the slave manifests, obviously those records pertain specifically to slaves that are coming in to Texas by ship or steamboat. Obviously, you know, we have some slaves arriving by land, but I'm specifically going to speak to the ones coming by way of the Gulf of Mexico. The slaves that are coming in, they're arriving obviously in Galveston, at the port of Galveston, and they're traveling by steamboat on up the bayou. And one of the reasons that the slave manifests are such a treasure as far as a primary source document or collection is that in 1808, the Congress outlawed the African slave trade. And so in order to keep Africans being smuggled into the United States, they had to document who's in the United States anyway, traveling by ship. So each ship that's leaving a port is going to have a document listing the names of the slaves and descriptions of them and their owner or slave trader and where they reside or where they're coming from. So those documents are very much a gold mine when someone like myself is researching a group of people. So you've got documents that start in 1808, and in fact, when I was looking at the documents about slaves coming into Texas specifically, they stop in 1860. So it's before the Civil War. The archivists at the National Archives, they don't know what happened to those records. They don't know if they got destroyed or something like that, or they're just missing, but they haven't been found. So that's the information that I'm having to analyze. And when the customs agents are checking those documents when ships are traveling in and out, they're trying to verify who owns these slaves and where they're going. So when the slaves are coming into Texas, it's interesting to start seeing who they are and who their owners are. And when the ships are coming into to Texas, the amazing thing that I found was there are more steamboats coming from New Orleans. We do have some other ships arriving by their sloops and brigs and schooners, but primarily it's steamboats. And of course, when they're coming up from Galveston, they're on steamboats because the bayou is a little difficult to travel on. Now, the other thing that I want you to keep in mind, when we're talking about slave ownership and slaves themselves in Texas, sometimes in popular culture, there's a myth or an assumption that everybody owned a slave back then, and that's not true. Slaves back then were very expensive. Some people considered it an investment. And so when you talk about the white population in Texas at the time, only 28% of the people could actually afford to buy a slave or invest in a slave. So you don't have widespread ownership when you think about slavery at that time period. Also, the other thing that's interesting is when you look at slaveholders in general across the South, fewer than when those 28% or so people, 28% people are owning slaves, they're not owning a lot of slaves, like giant plantations of slaves. They usually have less than 20. And then that's probably about 88% of the population of people that are slaveholders. And then for most people, even beyond that, 50% of those people are owning 5 slaves or less. So when you look at the slave manifest, over time you see very small numbers coming in with individuals. Now, the other thing that I discovered when I was looking through the slave manifest, it's not surprising that you're going to see prominent Texans, wealthy Texans, who are bringing slaves in. And so I've discovered you've got Governor Lamar, who's bringing in a slave. His slave was John, who arrived in 1843. So by the time the 1860s rolls around, he's going to be in his 40s, if in fact he survives during that time period. We've got the mayor of Houston, who was a slave owner as well. And there's also the first appointed judge here in the Republic of Texas, obviously. I hope everybody can hear me. I know the microphone cuts in and out sometimes. Now, on the slave manifest, like I said, you'll see small groups arriving in the early time period prior to the 1860s. The thing that I discovered was the ships arriving into Texas are coming very infrequently. When you look at the time period back in the 1830s, you'll see them arriving every few weeks with 1 or 2 or 5 slaves. And then over time, you see that start to really increase as the white population start coming into Texas. So in the 1840s, ships are arriving more frequently, sometimes twice a week, and then it gradually builds over time to 3 or 4 times a week. And then they're bringing groups of slaves about 10 or 20 at a time. Then when you get into the 1850s, you have nearly daily shipments of slaves coming in, and the numbers start increasing to like 20 to 35 people. Did you hear that? 20 to 35 individuals. Then occasionally you'll get larger boatloads of slaves being brought in. Some of the biggest cargoes I've seen range from 45 to 60 individuals coming into Galveston, and then some of those people are transferred to steamboat and brought on up to Houston. And here you can see an example where the customs agent wrote out the slave manifest of 45 slaves and 2 infants. I don't know why they always list the infants separately, but they do whenever they list that. Here's one of the slave manifests I found that has 60 slaves. When you look at the collection of the slave manifests, the when you have very large cargoes coming in, and for Houston or Galveston rather, and all the other ports in Texas, I'm not seeing anything bigger than 60 at a time. When you look at ships arriving into New Orleans, you're going to see really big slave manifests. The forms are about this big, and then the customs agent starts gluing together the slave manifest to fill the names in. I found one slave manifest that was 9 feet long with hundreds of names of people. So it's interesting, but it's also very disheartening to see how many people were impacted by the slave trade. Now, to give an idea of the people we're talking about, how many people were living in Houston at the time, here's the census data on the slave population. 1850, the black population, the enslaved population, is 21%. 1860, you'll see population is increasing up to 24%. Keep in mind that these numbers that we talk about, when you're looking at the slave population or population in general based on the census records, it's a moving target. And in Houston, you've got people coming and going, and it's hard to keep track of what the numbers are, because they change between the census records, the tax rolls, and people are being sold here in Houston, and they're sent out to plantations in the outer regions of the county or further out. So like I said, you've got a steady flow of people coming and going out of this area. Now, when the slaves are coming into Houston, there's different ways that people are involved within the institution of slavery. Not everybody, obviously, like I mentioned before, are able to afford to buy a slave, but everybody's really involved in it, because if you can't afford to buy a slave outright, and some people can, and they'll buy them at auction or at a private sale. But the other thing that I found really interesting when I was looking at the historical records is that people would get with others and pool their money to buy a slave. So they would get a partner. You could own a slave that only, some people even had like 1/6 of a slave that they owned. So they would pool their money and buy a slave, and then they'd take that slave and hire them out to make money. There was a lot of hiring out of slaves all through Houston. It's amazing how many people are out working. And so based on your investment in that slave owner would get their percentage of the wages of that slave. And the way they would actually try to hire them out is they would do private negotiations for people who would want to hire the slave labor. A lot of times you see people getting auctioned off for their labor down at the courthouse. And here's an early layout of Houston. Now, obviously, at this time, not all the lots are filled in with buildings, but this is how they did the town layout. But you can see where the courthouse square used to be located. And it was at the corner of Congress and Fannin Streets, and auctions were normally held on Tuesdays and Thursdays between 10 a.m. and 4 p.m. And so, can everybody hear me? I heard the microphone cut out, okay? I can always shout if everybody in the back can hear me. So today, if you're trying to figure out where this is located, if you go downtown, it's located on the Harris County Tax Office's block and the old courthouse steps where the auctions took place. It faces the side of the street that faces where the Harris County Law Library is today. So you can go down there and stand there if you want to. The other thing that I found that was fascinating to me is every once in a while in the historical record, you will find where a slave owner will allow certain slaves that he owns to hire themselves out for wages, which was really surprising to me. So some slaves had a little bit autonomy within the institution of slavery. So that slave could go out and offer their labor, negotiate the wages, give a cut to their owner, and keep a portion of it. And when they kept a portion of it, they were also responsible for their own food and their own housing. So that was pretty amazing. And we do have instances where slaves were able to save up their money to buy their freedom, as long as their slave owner allowed them to, and they could purchase their family members, because family was very important back then, as is today. So that's coming through in the historical records. Now, in order for people to know when auctions are happening, advertisements were placed in the newspaper. There were these posters posted around the business districts, and there were a number of individuals that were merchants and who were who handled the slave sales and auctions. There were a couple of areas that predominantly, besides the courthouse steps where they held auctions, along the west side of Main Street between Congress and Preston, some businesses referred to back then as the Long Row. There was also a place called Wilson's Block on Congress Street, and that was another location. So if you're ever wandering downtown, you can check that out. When a sale was done at the time, written receipts or written contracts were developed, and here's an example of one. Also, I wanted to give you a sense of what downtown, what today is downtown, but what Houston was like in a centralized location downtown. You can see at the bottom of the screen is where the wharf was located, where the steamboats came in. And somebody back then did this 3D rendering of what it looked like. So you can see some of the little buildings and the covered walkways and the boardwalks where they would try to keep out of the mud, as we heard about earlier from Dr. Weller. Over on the left side, you can see where the courthouse was located. On the right, you can see where the market square is located. Here's an image of Main Street. This is looking up toward Buffalo Bayou on Main Street. So you can see some actual photographs of what it looked like back then. All right, for the slaves back then, the types of things that they're doing, again, all the slaves of nearly all ages are working. Obviously, the kids that are under 6, they're not able to do much work, so they're just kind of hanging with their mothers, and they're also, if they're not with their mothers, they're being taken care of by another adult female slave that the slave owner would have available for that, usually someone who's elderly and not able to work as much. Then the younger kids, 6 to 11, they're more like going to do work around the house that's pretty easy for a small child to do. A young girl would be a nurse, taking care of infants, rocking them, keeping them entertained in some way. If they're a little older, they can help, change diapers and things like that. A little boy would be like a waiting person, fetching things, helping a slave owner to dress. Women, kind of like today almost, but not exactly, but women were always doing domestic type work, cooking and cleaning and doing laundry, and obviously back then it was a lot of labor involved in those activities because you don't have the conveniences that we have today. And of course the men are doing a lot of the heavier type of labor. In industry, they're going to be working in sawmills, cotton warehouses, and railroad construction, carpentry. I've got a document where a gentleman was working as a blacksmith. They were also working as teamsters, hauling things in wagons. The other thing is the yellow fever was a big problem here, and there were epidemics, and people were sick a lot. And so you have a lot of slaves that are helping tend to the ill and the disabled, and then they're burying the dead. So that was a gruesome part of their experience in living in Houston. As I mentioned, they were teamsters as well. There was even an incident where there was a complaint that some of the slaves were racing on Main Street, and there was an accident almost caused. So it was kind of a minor uproar. Here's an image of in the 1860s, and you can see how much cotton is being hauled out of here on rail, and some of the African Americans working in the rail yard and in the cotton industry. As I mentioned before, it's very expensive to buy slaves, and the value of slaves changed over time. You can see that on average, the value of slaves from $600 to $850 from 1848 to 1866. Keep in mind that the value of a slave really is connected to age, their ability to work, and willing to work well, inflation, and make sure their skills are marketable, and just the demand for slave labor. And so you can see how inflation can cause slave value to go up as well. So you can see that example with Susan Jordan. Her value went up in a very short time from $350 to $1,000. That's a huge jump. For hiring out values, I've discovered it's kind of hard to determine the value of that because the currency is very different from our value of currency today, and so don't try to keep in your head, oh, well, this is equivalent to X number of dollars in today's dollars. You can't even figure it out. But I wanted to at least share that with you. So a young child or a teen, if they were hiring that person's labor out, it's $3 per month specie. And back then when they refer to specie, they're talking about sterling silver coins. So that's what that is, if you're not familiar with the terminology. Confederate money has a different value as well, so it's kind of difficult, like I said, but I wanted to share that information with you. Now, I wanted to also share with you the comparison with the 1850s, the slaves' value in hiring their labor out. And the other thing that was interesting, in 1856, a complete change happens where you don't see as many slaves being hired out, and you see slave owners, especially through the probate court records, they're not wanting to hire them out to get the money for their labor. They're actually trying to sell them off. And I believe that there's so much rhetoric about the anti-slavery movement, and there's a lot of talk even from 1850 about the coming of war, that people are starting to think that slaves are going to become free and there's no value left and they're going to lose their investment. So I'm seeing from 1856 to 59, slaves are being sold off and people are trying to hold on to their cash. The other thing that I was looking for is what's happening within the slave community, what kind of resistance is happening, slaves running away and things like that. The thing that I found was when I looked at runaway slave ads in the newspapers, slaves pretty much are not running away from Houston. There are slaves running to Houston, which was surprising. There's a few slaves that actually try to leave Houston and they're heading to Mexico or further west into the West Texas area, staying with the Indians. I've even got documentation where a slave ran to California because the newspaper printed a map on how to get there. And he was very smart to follow the map. So, the runaway slaves that are coming to Houston, it's mainly because families have been broken up. And so if a man and his wife and children are here and the man gets sold away to a plantation over by Austin, he's going to run away and come home to his family. So that's how they're trying to deal with their situation. And then, of course, you have the influence of the war up until kind of the last minute of right before the Battle of Galveston. You don't have a whole lot of things happening here in Houston that's affecting the population. And so it was kind of funny when I came across the little news article that Houston is not yet feeling the effects of war, and then you've got the Battle of Galveston happening. Obviously, the news cycle's a little slower back then. And so all of a sudden, you have a lot of people flooding into Houston and seeking refuge. During the war, the other thing that was very challenging for the enslaved population is the men were basically conscripted into working for the military. And so it sounds like that would be very patriotic for those in the Confederacy, but the slave owners weren't getting any compensation. They weren't being paid, so they lost the slave labor and lost their income. And during the war, the locals were trying to raise money to benefit the soldiers, and so you find that people are actually having entertainment, musical events, theatrical events to raise funds, and the African American population is participating in these events because they're actually donating money. Now, I think there might be a little coercion involved in that, but they're attending these events along with the white population in Houston. The other thing that was interesting is in other southern states during the war, the value of slaves are dropping dramatically. In Houston, the value is skyrocketing. And also keep in mind that they're in the southern states closest to us, when the war starts invading into their areas, slaves are coming close to them. And so, I'm sorry. I'll try to wrap it up real quick. I know we're running behind time. All right, let me skip on a couple more slides and I'll wrap up in just one moment. The other thing within the slave population is they are involved in the church. They have church faith through Christ Church and Methodist Church, and the church records indicate that as well. I've got also slaves getting married in the rectory of the Christ Church, and slaves are getting baptized within the Christ Church and buried in the cemetery there at Christ Church. And of course, we're going to hear more about Juneteenth. Slaves in Houston, a lot of them were even still enslaved by 1867. And then, of course, you have the Freedmen's Bureau that are helping the newly freed slaves by providing assistance with housing, food, education, and through the Freedmen's Bank, they also are helping them to try to manage their money, although it failed and a lot of people lost their money. So these individuals are working and trying to function and bring their families together, and some of them are still working for their farmer owners. And marriages were very important, and family was very important. And the interesting thing is, you'll notice that you have interracial couples during that time after the war, but the numbers start dropping in 1872, and I assume it's because of social pressures and racism of the time. All right. If anyone has any questions later for me, I will be here for the conference all today, and you can certainly shoot me an email if you have any further questions after that. Thanks so much for your time.